Welcome to You Talk. In this episode, we need to discuss why the hell is the rent too damn high and what comes next.
In 2010, gubernatorial candidate for New York State, Jimmy McMillan, announced the single thing that he cared about as a candidate. Rent is too damn high. Now, he was never elected. 13 years later, the rent is still too damn high. And as anyone who's recently looked at the Sydney, Melbourne, Darwin, Brisbane property markets at least can tell you, the rent is still too damn high everywhere. Not only that, but the cost of living generally is increasing. You may remember from your childhood that there was a point at which unleaded petrol, plain old unleaded petrol, none of this premium E10, just plain old unleaded, was 70 cents per litre. Now we've seen that figure increase, and accounting for inflation, 100% and some. It seems like everything is getting more expensive. Your milk, your bread, your eggs, your petrol, your rents. Why is money worth less than it used to be? And why haven't our paychecks reflected the reality of that worth? Kyle,
Greed.
why is the rent too damn high?
Simple greed. Okay, so it's a little bit more complicated than that. I mean, there are various factors, but what it comes down to is the bulk of the increase is down to greed. So inflation, if I remember, was about 7% in the last year. Before that, there was a little bit higher inflation than usual, but nothing too out of the ordinary. So this is not, you know, unmanageable levels for inflation. So
7.8%.
7.8%. So, that's high, but it's not increased people's rent by around 50% high. I've heard a lot of stories, and my rent's been increased by nearly that. And a friend of mine, his rent was going to be increased by, I think, just over 20%, but he managed to negotiate that down. Um, an increase of around 10% would be fair enough. And, an increase in the cost of many food products by around, 10% would be fair enough. But we've seen more than an increase of 10%. We've seen increases upwards of, 20, 30, 40. In some cases, it's been not even 50, but like double the price for certain items. And that's
Okay,
insane.
so I've just quickly had a look at interest rates.
One more thing. One more thing. Because I'll get to that. But when taking a look at the profit margins of, these of property investors, of corporations, the duopoly of Coles and Woolworths and others, you actually see that they have soaring profits.
Unglaublich! Unglaublich!
So,
How can you forget mein savior Aldi?
Because I haven't checked into their profits. But that being said, it is insane that we can be having high inflation in the prices of things, that the inflation in terms of the value of the Australian dollar, that we can have inflation of 7%, and yet we can have inflation prices of different items of anywhere between 20 and 30 and 100%. And we can also see profits soaring sky high for these big corporations and for property investors, and rents soaring this high. The inflation and the increase in interest rates does not explain this level of increase.
Okay,
and so,
just
what we are seeing is pure greed.
Hang on a minute. Hang
Or
on a minute.
2/3 or more of this.
There might be a different problem here, which I was initially looking at interest rates because you mentioned property developers, and certainly they've come out relatively well from this.
Hmm.
Interest rate rises have been a thing, but they haven't been enough to account for this. But I was looking quickly at what a consumer price index, which is how we usually measure inflation, actually means. And the consumer price index is apparently representative of the financial burden that the average household incurs.
I'm keen to hear
So,
this number.
no, you're not, because the consumer price index indicates inflation of 7.8%. But what you have just said is that what the average household bears in terms of the price increase is closer to 50%. So, what we have to ask is the data being massaged in a way that may lead people to believe that this issue is less important than it is?
Or are we even asking the right questions in those? Are we looking at the right, are we getting the right data? That's an interesting question. A little bit outside of my area of knowledge just now.
I think that might be a question for asking a boffin, but the question we have here seems to have shifted a little bit to why is the rent too damn high? And why are we being told that the amount that we pay hasn't increased by as much as it has?
See, as much as I'd like to answer that question, I can't answer that question just now. But I
Okay,
can
so
answer the original second part of
yeah,
our question,
let's get
which
back.
is what comes
What's
next. What's next? Okay. This is the speed run version, so I can't really explain everything.
Okay, I'm just going to quickly jump in before you speed run and point out one simple fact of economics that absolutely everyone agrees upon, which is impressive. If you have money and you spend money and that money keeps moving around, then your economy is healthy. Because if the money is moving instead of staying in one place, more things get made, more things get bought, more things get sold. Everyone benefits.
Yes, that is an excellent, and I'd like to do a whole episode just on talking about that. But in lieu of that, the speedrun version of what happens next and, well, kind of why it's going to happen. So we have two massive problems. The rental and property market are incredibly overinflated. The price
There's
on
been
paper,
a bubble burst predicted for the last 6 years or so, but for some reason it always seems to be on the edge of bursting, but never quite enough to just.
Yeah, well, see, the reason for that is because the previous federal government was pumping money into the property sector. And so so there's two problems here. First, particularly in Sydney, you have roughly 4 property developers that intentionally keep 50% or about 50% of rental properties off the market in order to keep the prices artificially high. Essentially, it's a cartel. Then the second problem is that we have property speculation. Property speculation is where you buy up all the properties in an area, then
assuming
you just
that it'll
hold
turn
them.
out to be valuable. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you hold them. So you're holding them off the purchase market, and so you're artificially dropping the supply while the demand remains the same. Hence, the price
artificial
rises.
Scarcity and hoping that it works out for you.
So the problem in both cases is artificial scarcity. So that's the problem in both cases, along with, also a majority of banks lending being in the property sector, and effectively what was the number? 30% of Australia's wealth effectively having been funneled over the last 20 years into the property sector. So 30% of our total wealth in our nation is in property. So that's the setup we have. It's worse than the subprime mortgage crisis, and what comes next in around April and May is that the fixed rate the fixed rate interest rate mortgages. Fixed interest rate mortgages are going to change to variable rates, just like in the subprime mortgage crisis in the US. And what happened then, and what is easily predictable now, is that it will crash the markets. And also, very similarly to the US, our banking system basically combines merchant banking and savings banks and lending for property. It's all in the one bank. And so what we have
unlike
is the
the
exact same
US,
situation. Unlike the
but
US?
unlike the US, we have some slightly different customs regarding our banks, which mean the banks shouldn't need to be propped up with taxpayer money, because in Australia, banks are required to have bear with me. Banks are required to have capital that backs their operations. Like, yes.
See, I do know about this, but there's a problem with this as well.
The speculative stuff is all imaginary money, right? We know that. But at the same time, because of the legislative basis for that, the banks are assumed to have the burden of liability. And given the historic precedent of just giving the banks more money in the hopes that they don't fall over and give everyone a fair shake for a change, we saw that it didn't work in the US. So we theoretically have a buffer against such a calamitous...
Theoretically, but there's a thing here that I actually happen to know about. Most of that buffer is essentially shares in other of the big four banks.
Yep, and it also doesn't help that all of these big four banks operate sub-banks.
Yes, and essentially, we've got all four of the big banks in the exact same situation, and their buffer is in the other banks. So when they're all affected at the same time, which they will be by this situation,
they
because
would
they're all
still
running
all have
basically
capital
the same
to fall back on.
Nowhere near enough. There's problems with the capital. I've been reading about this in the last couple of months.
$1 million lira for a loaf of bread, anyone?
Perhaps worse.
This is that's what happened.
We've technically run out of time, so I need to get through this. So we're going to see property market collapse once the variable interest rates kick in, because people won't be able to afford their mortgage prices.
Which means the banks will foreclose.
Yeah, so we're going to see property prices collapse. The recent drops in property prices is going to be nothing compared to this. They're going to be dropping by anywhere up to 40%, which, because 30% of our nation's wealth is invested in property, means we are going to see a real drop in the wealth of this nation of 12% off the bat. Then there's the knock-on effect of small and large businesses that will go under from this, or that will have to lay off tons of staff from this, further weakening the economy and also affecting the banks as well. They're the ones who these mortgages are with. And so we're going to see, the bank's liquidity dry up very quickly. And so the banks will go into crisis, and then, not a whole lot of people know this, but in 2018, it's burned into my mind. I think it was February 12th, 2018. A bail-in bill was pushed through Parliament, while only 13 members in both houses of Parliament were present.
I recall
and it was only given, I think, 2 minutes of debate. 2 minutes of debate. And what this does is it allows APRA, the supposed regulator of the banks, more on that another time, to give the banks permission to swipe a portion of people's savings and deposits to cover a shortfall in the event of a crisis. Now,
and if you can pay it back, that's very cool. But if you can't, what we've seen in other countries.
Well, in other countries, what we've seen is it hasn't worked, and they actually have to have a bailout anyway. So what we're going to see is the property market collapse, businesses collapse, the banks are then about to fall over. They instigate bail-in. It happens. It doesn't work. Then they need a bailout anyway. So
what I'm hearing is it's a good time to invest in hiding the cameras under the bed.
Yes.
Just invest in Leicas. Leicas are eternal.
Yeah. So we're gonna see essentially the subprime mortgage crisis in the US. However, all of the raw numbers and data indicates that our setup situation is worse. More of our nation's wealth invested in banking, invested in property. More of banking's mortgages, more of their lending is in property, and we're going to see, and essentially property prices are more overinflated. So we will see essentially the banks on the verge of collapse, but worse than in the US during the subprime mortgage crisis. And that's going to happen probably within a few months of those variable interest rates kicking in. I don't see it being propped up past the end of this year. So that's when the true crisis shall begin. We need to do another episode just on
the prospective crisis.
Yeah, see, we're way over time already, so we've run out of time for this. But we need to do more episodes on this, because this, basically, this.
Why is the rent too high? Part 2. Let's do that then. Hey.
Yes. All right. For now, take care. Hope this has been informative, even though I've tried to get through a massive amount of information in just like the tiniest amount of time. And yeah, take care. Have fun. Good luck.
Ciao.